Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate it, and I hope that this talk is going to be helpful. Now, obviously, it's difficult to talk about mental health in 20 minutes, but the goal of this talk is to give you some type of framework that you can find a way to start thinking about it and treating it more systematically. So, what are we going to talk about? Well, there's three parts. First is to feel it, and you may be thinking, well, no, Eugene, I feel pretty depressed. I don't need any help with that. But the important thing is to understand how we, at least in the English language, we use the same word to mean a bunch of different things, right? Like sometimes we'll say, oh, my sports team lost, I'm feeling depressed, right? And that's not the same thing. And so going to talk about understanding, okay, how does depression feel different than maybe other emotions that are similar that you're used to? Next is to track it, right? The majority of us here are data professionals, and so I think it's beneficial to treat this as a data problem. Because at least for me, when I can externalize it, then it becomes more real, right? Because the problem is, at least with depression and often with anxiety, you get these horse blinders on, and all you can see is today. And if today you're having a bad day, then you think it's going to be like that for the rest of your life, right? So if we can track it, then we can externalize it and see, oh no, like for me, I probably have some variety of seasonal affective disorder. In the wintertime, I struggle. And I can see on a little chart, oh, Eugene doesn't do well in the winter, let's send him somewhere warm, right? And I've had to learn that the hard way because I think I can just brute force my way through the wintertime. And then, related, we're going to talk about how you can treat it. So again, quick 20-minute talk, happy to talk more after, happy to answer any online questions that pop up. So let's get started. Content warning. Unsurprisingly, actually, no, this is surprising. I have some photography from college to represent emotions. And as you can imagine, they're very emotional, right? So I want to give you a heads up on that. Might discuss some negative self-talk, thoughts like, hey, oh, I'm an idiot, I'm a jerk, that sort of thing. You might see a grown man crying on stage. So that's just a content warning for everyone there. In case that upsets you or makes you uncomfortable, you may want to leave now. Your mileage will vary. I am not a psychologist, I am not a doctor, I am some schmuck who's willing to share way too much of his personal life up on stage. And so I'm just hoping that some of these things may be beneficial for you, but I do not expect that it's going to transfer one-to-one to anyone else, right? So I just want to be clear about that. So for me, I have dealt with depression since college. Before that, I didn't have any particular issues of that variety, although I knew something was likely coming because my mom has bipolar with schizotypal affect, and mental health issues are highly heritable. Now, I was scared I was going to get hit with the bipolar bus, and I'm like, all right, I dodged that. Oh no, I'm depressed now. And a big part of that was a loss of family support. So before college, I lived with my dad, my parents were separated, and I lived with my grandparents, and I lived with my sibling. And all my aunts and uncles would come visit my grandparents. And in college, my grandparents started to get older and pass away, and people moved away, and my sibling moved out. And suddenly I was alone. And the family support that helped keep me buoyed disappeared, and I found out that there was a fragility there that I wasn't aware of. I do a bunch of things to treat it. Sometimes it feels like throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. But there's a number of different approaches that I take. I treat it like Batman and his utility belt, like I'm just trying a bunch of stuff, and we'll talk about some of those treatments. And I have not solved it. I have treated it, I manage it. I hope one day to get rid of it. I think I can accomplish that. But right now, it's a lot more like the fact that I'm diabetic. So I have a little sensor on my arm that tells me how my blood sugar is every 5 minutes. And I have alarms set that if it gets too high or low, it'll alert me. And I'm a type 1 diabetic, so I have to take insulin every day. I take multiple daily injections in order to thrive. And if I didn't, I would be out in the hospital somewhere, right? And so at least for now, the way that I deal with depression is a lot more the way that I deal with diabetes. I haven't cured it, I treat it, and I mitigate it. So, what does depression feel like, right? Because there's a language gap, there's a communication challenge when we talk about depression. And I'll talk about some of the why, some of what's different, but I think pictures do a better job. So let me show you what grief looks like. This is grief. This is not depression. This is normal, natural, healthy. This is a good thing. This is what it feels like when love is lost. This was a picture I took. I experimented with photography in college when my grandfather died. Again, I told you I had a lot of familial support disappear, and he was the first person who ever died in my life. And I wrote some stupid college-level poem about how, I found that suit at Goodwill. I love shopping at Goodwill for like used suits, and I didn't know at the time that the first time I would wear it would be at a funeral. This is a good thing. This is the human condition. This is not depression. This is depression. Depression, I think Freud said it's anger turned inwards. And that's not accurate, but it feels that way sometimes, right? And we're going to talk about that, but depression is often correlated with cognitive distortions. It's never just a mood disorder. It is a disorder of how you think and perceive the world, and it's often subtle. And we'll talk about some of those subtleties. But that's one of the reasons why it's important to track these things, because your understanding of the world becomes distorted. And to that effect, when I posted this picture, I was surprised how many people it resonated with. This was back in, sorry about the Spanish, I practiced Spanish by changing the language on stuff. But back in 2008, right? And I was like, why is everyone like this? And specifically, there was a key point here. At the time, I had this continual, irrational thought that I was an evil person. It was bugging me because I couldn't convince myself out of it. And that's the key thing. Depression feels like continual, irrational thoughts that you can't convince your way out of. And unfortunately, that's the trap for everyone here, because if you're at this conference, I presume you're pretty smart folks, and you get paid to be smart. You get paid to use your brain. And so when your brain turns against you, you have a problem that you might think you can just logic your way out of. And there's treatments related to that, like cognitive behavioral therapy, but you can't just think your way out of this problem alone. You need treatment. So let's see how we're doing on time. Sweet. Doing good. So, depression. Like I said, don't expect to outthink this. A lot of times, it's a lot more like, if you've ever had, I don't know what they're called here, but a Chinese finger trap, the ones where like you put your fingers in and you try to pull out and it tightens and you can't get your fingers out. Or like quicksand, where the more you thrash around, the worse that it gets, right? So one of the key things I want you to understand is that it's the rare situation where sometimes your greatest asset has been turned against you. And so trying to use that same asset to get you out of the problem, it's like a circular reference in Excel. You've thrown a not applicable error, everything falls apart. So what is depression? How do we break it up into things that we can feel, see, hear, and understand? And again, there's a misunderstanding that it's this blurry idea of sadness, right? And there was a behavioral health workbook that I went through that really helped me because it gave me 3 lessons that occur. Again, these things occur very often with depression, but rarely with sadness. Feeling helpless, feeling like there's no way to get out of this situation, no way to help yourself out of it. Feeling hopeless. So not only do you think the current situation is unmanageable, but that it will never become manageable, it will never change. Basically, you're projecting your current emotional state, your current lived experience indefinitely into the future, but more importantly, feeling worthless. Not only are you projecting your current emotional state outward into the infinite future, but in towards yourself. And you start saying things like, I'm a failure, I'm a loser, I'm an idiot, right? And so if all of these apply to you, then please seek help, because it's a good sign that you're dealing with depression. And again, it's subtle. So I like to think of depression as like a wobbly cart, right? So I don't know how it is here, but in the United States, we have this problem that you go to the grocery store, and if you grab the first cart that someone has left out, it's one with a bad wheel, right? And the thing is, you can manage that, right? Like, okay, fine, I have to push a little bit harder to the left and I'll be fine. But the moment you let go of the control, it rams and knocks down, I've been told they're called biscuits here instead of cookies, knocks down all the biscuits, causes a mess, right? And so that's the thing is, oftentimes you can, for a time, brute force your way through it, or oftentimes you can self-correct if you have the energy and resources, but it's subtle. It's like a wobbly cart. It's like you're just drifting to the side a little bit, and you're feeling like you need to correct. And so, and what do I mean by that? That there's always this slight drift. What is the drift? Depression is a bias. So when we think about machine learning or artificial intelligence or whatever, sometimes if you work in that field, you might talk about bias in the algorithm, right? Specifically, let's say you do a linear regression or some other thing, it may not be perfectly calibrated, right? If I make an algorithm to predict the weather tomorrow, it might be biased to higher temperatures, right? It might be always off by 10 degrees upwards, right? Well, we have these biases in our lives and how we explain events that happen to us. Specifically, the 3 Ps. Personal, right? So imagine I'm passing Dan in the expo hall and I say, "Hi, Dan," and he doesn't look at me, he doesn't wave, he just walks on by. Now, yeah, I mean, he's a jerk, I'm sorry. And that could happen for multiple reasons, right? But I am gonna have an explanatory style as to how I put together a story of what just happened, right? Now, a normal person who has a good relationship might say, "Oh, maybe he's busy, maybe he's tired, I think I saw him doing karaoke last night, it's not about me." But when you're depressed, you often say, "It is about me. It's personal. Dan must be mad at me, he's upset, I've screwed up somehow." The next P is pervasive, right? "Oh, I'm always screwing up. No one ever waves at me, no one ever says hi." And you take one incident and you use it to explain everything in your life. You take one bad, like how many times, like when you were in school, you got all A's but one B and you're like, "Well, I'm a failure." Or in the workplace today, you get feedback from your boss and she's like, "You nailed it. You got this great, but can we change the font color?" And you're like, "I am a dummy. Why bother?" Right? And the third explanatory style is permanent. "I'm always gonna be an idiot. I'm always gonna be a dummy. No one will ever wave at me at a sequel pits ever again," right? And I joke for exaggeration to help communicate it, but this is real and this is studied. And I have a reference to like a really good Wikipedia page. People with depression tend to correlate with these explanatory styles. They take the same inputs, but their output is biased in a particular direction, and it can be subtle. It's not always an on-off switch. It's how we explain things to ourselves in this world. So, that's how you feel it. That's how you understand some of what's going on inside of your mind. Let's collect some data, shall we? So let me see how we're doing on time. All right, we should be good. So I use an app called Dailyo. This was me in 2020, and this was me in 2021. The dots represent my mood on you could call it a 5-point Likert scale. As far as I'm concerned, 5 smiley faces come up. And so on the far left, the orange is great, amazing, rad. Far right, the gray is, this is awful. And thankfully, those days are rare for me. Usually it's a green, as you can tell by the numbers, right? And what you can do is you can actually, you can map it out. And you can see how your years compared. Now, I probably should normalize a little bit, because technically, I think 2021, I put in more entries. But you can see at a glance, something happened in 2020. I don't know if anyone knows what. That was a bad year for Eugene, right? And then the next year was better. I had more green days. I had more smiling days and fewer just crying at home type of days. And in addition to that, you can find patterns. So this is probably the best one that I have. And it's funny, I did not know about these patterns until I did this talk last year, and I pulled out the data. And there were a couple big things. So this is a 2-week rolling average because the individual data points are too messy, right? They jump too much. An ideal might be 7 days or something like that. But my mom got diagnosed with breast cancer. She's fine now. Everything's fine. It was benign. She had the surgery. But you can see my mood, my affect plummeted like a rock. I was an absolute mess for a week. And then we had the US election. It was nerve-wracking for a lot of people. A lot of you here probably had opinions on it. I don't need to know them, but you can imagine, like, it was stressful because there was a lot of uncertainty no matter what side of the political aisle you were on. And then I got vaccinated and my mood just shot up, right? Because I could finally start thinking about the future here. The funny part is the little jaggy parts at the beginning of the year. I do consulting, and so I get paid monthly often. So I'm pretty sure that's my theory, is that I would get paid at the beginning of the month, and I'd be like, I'm doing great. And then at the end of the month, I'm going to die in the gutter. I have no money. But I wouldn't have known any of this stuff if I hadn't actually tracked it and then looked at it. And so, you know, it's not always perfect, but it can be useful information. Okay. Yep. Another thing you can do is you can do a weekly self-assessment. There's multiple depression inventories. They look like this. This is how I was in November. It's about the same, a little bit better because BITS has been awesome. I got some sunshine in Florida, so probably a little bit lower. But then I can look and see, okay, back in November I was mildly depressed, right? And there's been times I've been moderately depressed. I thankfully have never been any higher than that, because then at that point you like can't get out of bed. But if you do this once a week, you have something that's been clinically tested, that's validated, and you can track how are you doing so that you can see that you're making progress. Very often, as soon as I start tracking it, I start thinking about how I can improve it. Another thing that you can do, I track automatic negative thoughts a lot of times, especially during the winter time. So I have a lot of those thoughts of, oh, Eugene's an idiot, Eugene's a jerk, whatever, Eugene's a failure. And I will buy a tally counter, you know, for like laps or what have you. And then I will just track it on the calendar. And again, when you start tracking it, you often start treating it. Just inherently, you're like, wow, 20's a lot. I've had worse days. I've had 50 or 100 on some of my worst days. You're like, maybe I should do something about that and figure out what stressors are causing this problem. Finally, let's start treating it. All right, doing good. 4 slides, 5 minutes, or 3 minutes. So how do I manage? I manage in 2 ways. Treatments and lifestyle. These go hand in hand, but they're different about how you're going to learn about them and how you're going to think about them. So treatments. One of the things that I do, there's a book I reference later, I think it's like Feeling Good, that covers cognitive behavioral therapy. It's a validated treatment. It's the gold standard in depression treatment today. And the big thing about it is you have some triggering event. Dan doesn't wave to me. That's the A, the activating event. B is the belief. The belief is Dan hates me. It's true, I understand, it's fine. And then C is the consequence. The consequence is I say those things to myself. Maybe I withdraw and don't go to the party because then I might see Dan in a dragon costume and it's going to be awkward, right? And so you can build space between the activating event and the thought and the consequence, and you can treat it better. Next one is mindfulness meditation, right? So just being more mindful of those thoughts, more aware of them. It's amazing the things that bounce around in your head, and if you can find a way to slow down and see what's going on inside of you, it's easier to catch it and treat it. And if you do the tally counter thing, you'll start to pick that up. At first, the numbers will be low, and then you'll catch yourself and be like, oh, wait, no, this is happening all the time. Talk therapy. You know, traditional just talking with someone has been helpful for me, and it's changed over time, right? Like, I've had 2 talk therapists, and it was of a particular duration. There got to be a point with the last one where he was like, I think you've got all the tools you need. I think you just need to do it. And I'm like, okay. I'm on antidepressants. I take 20 milligrams of Lexapro. For me, it was not a silver bullet. It was a floor function mathematically. If my mood is some sine wave, it capped the bottom of those moods, right? So I still have the gray malaise of depression, but I don't have the black, dark nights that would happen sometimes. And so for me, it doesn't make me happier, it just makes the worst times not as bad. Lifestyle changes. So get sleep. This sounds obvious, but when you track it, I have empirically measured that I will have twice as many negative thoughts on a day that I slept poorly. Sunshine. I'm real big on getting sunshine and running out of time here. Social support, exercise, habit building. Habits make your life easier, make it easier to do these things when you're having trouble. Finally, go and take a screenshot. I don't have time to go through all these right now, but these are all books that have helped me at one point or another in dealing with this stuff. All right, thank you, everyone. I'll be around. I'm happy to talk here or in the community zone. Didn't have any questions online, but thank you for everyone who attended digitally.